Charles Townshend becomes Prime Minister of Britain in 1766. That means he's in charge of Parliament. And in the following year, 1767, the Townshend Acts are passed. That's a tax on all paper, all glass, all paint, all lead, and all tea. And Townshend seeks to strongly enforce these new taxes by creating what's called the American Board of Customs Commissioners. This is based out of Boston, and they are going to enforce the Townshend Act taxes. He also creates more vice admiralty courts to try people for smuggling, and he begins enforcing the Quartering Act from 1765, which said that colonists had to house and provide food for British soldiers. This is most commonly done in New York. The response from the colonists are widespread boycotts of British goods, and the Massachusetts House of Representatives, their colonial assembly, asks the other colonies for suggestions for resistance. However, from the British perspective, this request for ideas for resistance is seen as treason, and they order Massachusetts to rescind or take back their request for ideas for resistance. Massachusetts chooses to ignore that request, and as a result, the Massachusetts House of Representatives is dissolved by the British government. They are sent home. They are not allowed to do their job anymore. The royal governor is in sole control of the colony of Massachusetts. Massachusetts gains the support of other colonies. Other colonial assemblies speak out against what happened to Massachusetts, and those colonial assemblies are also dissolved. They are sent home. They no longer have any power and authority, and the royal governors have almost complete control over some of the colonies. The colonists, though, are communicating about these events. They're talking about how much they dislike these new taxes with each other. And they believe that they have a righteous cause and that the British are evil. To save money, soldiers are sent from the frontier to quarter in peaceful Boston. So British soldiers who were out on the frontier protecting the colonies from Indian attack are sent out of the frontier, where it's expensive to keep them in the field, to Boston, where they can maybe be housed in someone's hotel or boarding house. This leads to some minor conflicts, though, between the British soldiers and American colonists. British soldiers are not the most polite and well-spoken, so the amount of obscenities that they're using on a regular basis is disconcerting to the Puritan people of Boston. British soldiers are publicly whipped for punishment for disobeying orders, and British soldiers grab jobs in their downtime when they're not required to be soldiers. They pick up jobs in Boston, which means that they're now competing economically with some of the people of Boston. Also, having the soldiers in Boston supports the widespread conspiracy theory that the soldiers aren't there to protect Americans, because they're not out on the frontier anymore where they were protecting us, but that they are there to oppress the Americans, that they are there to take away liberties, that they are there to help collect taxes. It's in this climate that on March 5th, 1770, some boys and basically street punks were throwing rocks and snowballs and yelling nasty things to some of the British soldiers that were on patrol outside the Customs Commissioner's office. This is the tax collection office. The soldiers, not able to see how many people were in the crowd and being pelted with rocks, panicked and began firing on the crowd, and 5 Americans were killed. This reaction, this event, is sensationalized by the American media. It's called the Boston Massacre by American newspapers, and leads to a very strong reaction from people in all the colonies. To avoid any further problems, Parliament moves that army onto an island in Boston Harbor so that they're no longer conflicting with the people of Boston. Parliament also repeals the Townshend Acts. This was because this was hurting British manufacturers, and it was actually encouraging Americans to produce their own goods rather than buy British goods. However, Parliament kept the tax on tea as a message to the colonists that Parliament is in charge, that they are the sovereign ruler over the colonies, and they can decide what's taxed and what is not. So the customs commissioners that were created by the Townshend Acts have become corrupt, and they're abusing their power. They are harassing common colonists and elites of the colonial society. For example, John Hancock, who was a wealthy merchant who made a lot of money smuggling goods as well. It's in this time with these corrupt customs commissioners that the customs ship, the HMS Gaspee, was burned in Rhode Island. And when investigators go to find out who torched the ship, everybody in Rhode Island says that they didn't see a thing. They have no idea what happened. Samuel Adams was one of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, and Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty are going to continue to rail against this British tyranny. They are upset that that tax on tea remains, and that this tax is going to be used to pay judges' salaries, meaning that the judges have become independent of the colonial assemblies. The judges are no longer responsive to the needs of the colonists and the colonial assemblies because they're getting their paycheck from the British. The Sons of Liberty commemorate the anniversaries for the repeal of the Stamp Act, which is considered a big win for the Patriots, and commemorate the anniversary of the Boston Massacre so that people remember what the British did. And the Sons of Liberty and others create what are called committees of correspondence. These were a colonial network for sharing information, for getting the word out to other colonies and people in other parts of the 13 colonies without the British knowing about it. All right. So let's talk about the Boston Tea Party next. And the Boston Tea Party is a direct result of what's called the Tea Act. And the Tea Act was an attempt by the British government to bail out or save a great big British company, the East India Company. It's a major British corporation. However, it's losing money. What the Tea Act would do would give the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in the Americas. This means that they would have no middlemen. They would also not pay any taxes on their tea in England, but the tax stays in place in America. This looks like a scheme to win the support for Parliament's authority to tax Americans. It actually lowered the tax on tea, but it gives a monopoly to the East India Company and keeps the tax in place. The people who it's really going to hurt, the people who are upset about it, are American merchants who have been smuggling in Dutch tea or French tea or tea from other places. They're going to be cut out completely because the East India Company can now sell tea for so cheap in the Americas. As a result, when East India Company ships arrive in New York, in Philadelphia, they are turned away. They are sent back. They are told that they are not allowed to unload in those harbors. In Boston, the royal governor tells the East India Company ships to stay. The colonists tell them, don't unload. So the ships wait in the harbor. And on December 16th, 1773, over 300 chests of tea were dumped into the harbor. And the people doing it were disguised as Native Americans, but many people knew that they were probably members of the Sons of Liberty. And Sam Adams, who was not present, comes out later to defend the actions of those people and what they did. This leads to what are called the coercive acts, or sometimes called here the Intolerable Acts. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British closed the port of Boston. And everybody in the Massachusetts government will now be appointed. There are no longer any elected representatives in the Massachusetts government. In terms of local government, local governments are only allowed to have one town hall meeting per year. Also, additional troops are going to be quartered in Boston. And finally, British citizens who are accused of a crime will no longer stand trial in the colonies. Instead, they will be sent home to England to stand trial in England, where they'll be much more likely to get off. right after the Intolerable Acts, the Quebec Act is passed. And sometimes this is grouped in with the Intolerable Acts, but it's a separate act. And in 1774, the Quebec Act is passed, which says that the province of Quebec, which the British got from the French after the French and Indian War, extends all the way down into the Midwest, as you can see there. This is upsetting because that was land that the colonies were hoping to expand into. It's also upsetting because many of the people in Quebec are still Catholic, and many of the people in the colonies are Protestant. So this is seen as a threat to expansion and a threat to Protestant religion. The Quebec Act and the Intolerable Acts have a profound effect of moving moderate colonists to the side of the radicals opposed to the British. More and more colonists are seeing the British as evil. And there's now widespread colonial support for Boston in response to what the British are doing. And the big question that comes out of this is, does Parliament really have the final say?